combustion efficiency, one of the options that we had to increase the release of chemical energy from the fuel within our magic window was reduce the endothermic losses to vaporization. Put it another way, if we can heat the fuel, it'll more readily vaporize ahead of time. It'll speed up the combustion process because it's already vaporized, and B, we're not going to sacrifice that combustion chemical energy to vaporize the fuel. So heating the fuel, even a couple of degrees will help. We don't need a lot to just help things along. Now ideally, when we looked at the chemical composition of gasoline, we saw dodecane, which at atmospheric pressure vaporized at 420 degrees. And the pressures of combustion is probably well over 500 degrees. So ideally, if we could heat the fuel to about 500 degrees and a high pressure fuel rail, where the high pressure will keep it from vapor locking and percolating, and then we go from that high pressure fuel rail through the injector to the low pressure intake manifold, it'd be like a pressure cooker. So if you've ever watched a pressure cooker, when that little pressure relief valve kicks, you see just a little stream of steam, and then it disappears because the temperature is so high that those little liquid droplets, if you can see the steam, it's liquid droplets, but you can only see it this far because there's so much thermal energy in that steam that it quickly vaporizes off. And that's what we would love to be able to do with the fuel. But unfortunately, 500 degrees is going to kill anything and everything that's currently part of our production fuel system. So the compromise is engine coolant temperatures. Why engine coolant temperatures? Because we know that everything on that engine is designed to withstand higher than engine coolant temperatures. So that means the fuel injectors are going to be able to handle engine coolant temperatures. The fuel rail, the fuel lines are going to be able to handle engine coolant temperatures. So when it comes to heating the fuel, let's go over a couple of the different pieces of hardware. Now, starting with this one. This was a production fuel heater specifically for fuel economy and emissions for fuel injected vehicles. You have an engine coolant inlet and an engine coolant outlet, which would be the brass fittings, and then you have your fuel line inlet and your fuel line outlet. And this particular one in the lower right corner of the image you can see is a valve where you can regulate the heat if you feel the need. There's also hydraulic coolers for forklifts and other type of industrial equipment. There you have the fuel, well, it'd be hydraulic fluid coming in the capped ends with the white plastic caps on. That's what you're trying to cool down to engine coolant temperature. And then the two nipples on the right side of the housing, you would have engine coolant in and engine coolant out. So to use something like this on an automobile, engine coolant in, engine coolant out. Just replace the hydraulic fluid with your fuel, and now you've got something that's already certified to handle 5,000 psi. That's way more than the 50 psi that a typical fuel system will see. So that would be another way of heating the fuel safely. Quick, simple, down and dirty, get her done. You could do nothing more than just take some steel fuel line and strap it to a radiator hose. And then ideally you would go back and wrap some kind of an insulation around that, such a way that it holds more of the heat in. Just be sure to use high pressure fuel line. Don't use the stuff rated for carburetors when you do this. And fuel line clamps. They're not the worm style, they're special clamps for high pressure fuel lines. A product that is no longer in production that I've used in the past, it's had a name or two over the years. We call it the magnetic heat exchanger. The magnetic heat exchanger is this gorgeous anodized aluminum housing, has fuel line fittings on either end, and it would strap to a radiator hose. You get a couple of degrees worth of thermal energy in there, not enough to hurt anything. The kit, as it was used, came with the special fittings, so it was almost plug and play. High pressure plastic fuel line. A header wrap. This is the fiberglass header wrap. When we saw the wrapped exhaust manifold, it was this fiberglass wrap. So we're going to just wrap some of this around the whole thing to hold that heat in. And then of course the special hose cutters for the plastic tubing. Side cutters is going to crimp it sideways. You don't want to do that. And then to get the hose on these fittings, you get some boiling water, dip the end of the hose in, dip your magnetic heat exchanger in. They're both nice and warm. It softens the plastic. It'll slide on. And then there's special clamps in here that use special crimping pliers which come with the kit. Just some images here. There's one that's properly clamped and strapped to a heater hose. And then here it is after it has the thermal wrap installed. And if you look very carefully, you'll see at the fringe edges what looks like aluminum foil. Yes. So if you strap it on, put a wrap of aluminum foil around it, and then the header wrap, the aluminum foil, very, very conductive, thermally conductive. The aluminum will help transfer just a little bit more of that heat into your fuel through the body of the magnetic heat exchanger. So heating the fuel safely can be done in a myriad of different ways. And why is that beneficial? When you look at a liquid, whether it's water or gasoline, it's molecules that are bonded together into a solid. And then you have these tiny solids that are bouncing around each other. This is called clusters. Now, as the temperature of water, let's use as an example, as the temperature of water goes lower and lower, the clusters get bigger and bigger and bigger, till finally you hit that freezing point and the whole becomes one solid block of ice. Now it's one big cluster. Going the other direction, as you add heat to the liquid, the clusters get smaller and smaller and smaller until finally they just free float into the air as single molecules. Humidity. And there's no clustering at all. So heating the fuel will help reduce the cluster size. Even though it's still a liquid, it'll reduce the cluster size so that when that fuel goes through the injector, more of it can readily vaporize. Smaller clusters have more surface area than bigger clusters.